for joining us today. If anyone here doesn't know me, my name is Barry Cranford. I'm the organizer of a bunch of communities, largely in the tech space and mainly in London. One of the big ones is the London CTOs. Last year, we decided to run a CTO job club and a CTO lunch club. And CTO Lunch Club was a weekly recurring event, happened every Friday lunchtime. Started small with about 5 people coming. And now we've got over 50 people coming each week. Really cool, all virtual. And so, yeah, people can just drop in and have a different host, different attendees each week. So I've been working increasingly with Turntabl, who are the sponsors of today's event. And they work a lot in the financial services space. And we've spoken to one of the people who said, oh, it was a shame we couldn't have something like the CTO Lunch Club, but in the financial services space. And that became this. So we're at a lunch at the time and was just like, what kind of topic would be good for the first event? Everyone suggested DORA. So thankfully, Matt, Richard, and Tim stepped in. And of course, Sam, who's going to lead the session today. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Sam.
Thanks, Barry, and everyone. Hope that everyone's joining us is feeling well and enjoying Tuesday. I'm dialing in from Brooklyn, where it's cold and wet, but because we're a coffee club, I've got my coffee, and I want to take a minute to just talk about my special coffee mug. So my wife bought me a birthday present last year, and she bought me an Ember mug. And if you haven't heard of Ember, and you're a coffee person, it's an absolute game changer. It's got a heating element in the bottom, and the coaster is a recharging pad. And if you are a coffee person that likes to keep your drink going all morning, it's absolutely fantastic. So that's my contribution to the coffee side of things today. I'll introduce myself, and then we'll go through our panel and ask the 3 gents here to introduce themselves. My name is Sam Moorhouse, and I run a software development agency called Turntabl, and we have a big office in Accra and Ghana, where we do a whole bunch of our work. So if you look at a world map, Ghana is pretty much due south of the UK. So people come to us when they've tried offshoring and they've suffered either quality or time zone issues. So if that sounds like you, then give me a call. But for the time being here, we're here to talk about DORA, the legislation that was signed into law in the EU and affects the UK earlier this year. And so on our panel today, we've got to talk about Nora Matt Scott from NimbusPay, Tim Palmer from Blue Hat, and Richard Halldearn from Codecutter.io. So in that order, folks, I'll ask you to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, hi, I'm Matt Scott. I've worked in financial services for the last 22 years, most notably at Renovite Technologies. I got acquired by JP Morgan Chase, and more recently at NimbusPay Technologies.
Hi, Tim Palmer. I run Blue Hat consultancy, working in financial technology. Previous background in Citibank and Deutsche and the big companies, then moved into much smaller buy-side firms, where I was responsible for legislation implementation around MiFID II and EMIR. And nice to meet you all.
Hi, my name is Richard Halldearn. I've just exited from a SaaS business that I set up in Canada. Prior to that, I spent a decade in financial services, running market risk and building market risk systems for Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, and Morgan Stanley.
Thanks very much. So folks in the audience, we've got wide coverage of startups and enterprise and across the whole financial services sector. So whilst I've got a bunch of questions and conversations set up with the folks right here, we're really, really keen for this to be a discussion. So we don't stand on ceremony. If you want to come off mute and jump in with a question, that's absolutely fine. And hopefully it'll lead to some really interesting discussion. So I'd like to start off with just like 10,000-foot view. What is DORA? And I think Matt from NimbusPay, you're really well placed to describe this for us. Just give us a couple of minutes of what the legislation is, what it covers, and how it's been implemented.
Yeah, so the Digital Operational Resilience Act, it covers 5 main key areas. So it covers ICT risk management, it covers major incident reporting, which I link to observability in the technology side. There's also a requirement for operational resilience testing. So that's linked with architectural design and testing, automated testing. Third-party contractual arrangements. So this is linked to your procurement strategy. And then there's the last one, which is oversight, which is critical ICT third-party providers, which is kind of linked to the procurement strategy piece, but it's more of a business-orientated thing. But the threads that flow through from a technology perspective are: what's your observability strategy, what's your architecture design and your automated test strategy, and what's your technology procurement strategy. Those are the three from a technologist perspective. The other elements are more business-orientated elements.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I know that, Tim, you've got some thoughts about existing legislation that currently covers financial services and how DORA plays into that. What's the story there?
So my reading of DORA has been that it's really a tidying up exercise on a lot of holes in all the regulations. So when you look at EMIR, Dodd-Frank, Sarbanes-Oxley, if you go back through all the regulations hit us since 2008, and prior to that, these regulatory frameworks always had some sort of element of technology within them. DORA tried to bring them all under one umbrella. I think it also includes, it widens the scope of the firms that are captured by the regulation. So it means that smaller firms now have to satisfy the DORA regulations, whereas when previous versions of regulations did not capture them. So it's tidying up a lot of those loose ends. But I think to many of the firms that we're working with, DORA hasn't been a huge burden to them because they were already having to cover many of the concerns through EMIR and other rules that came in the last decade or so.
So what we're hearing is that and we'll talk a little bit about scope later on today, but I think what we're hearing is that for companies that were already in this space and were already large enough to be covered by existing legislation, DORA is not too burdensome. But for maybe smaller organizations, DORA has moved into their space and they're now finding that there is a regulation and legislation they now need to be conforming with. Is that right?
That's my understanding from the firms that we're working with.
So from a software perspective, how does it change how we architect software? Like as a developer or as a project manager or an architect, I guess traditionally I would have built my software, with some orchestration in mind, with some cloud service provider in mind. I might have chosen Amazon or Google. What changes does it make? How do I think differently today? Matt, let's start with you.
Well, so the traditional viewpoint with cloud used to be lift and shift, which is predominantly focused around infrastructure as a service. By following that approach, it's not only the most expensive option, it's also one of the least portable. The cloud providers got in on this and pushed very heavily the trend or the fashion towards platform as a service and their software as a service options, which are perceived as an easy route for development, but they lock you into the vendor because they're very sticky solutions. So what I'm expecting to see as a result of DORA is people transitioning more towards using infrastructure as a code automation tools and containerized workloads and Kubernetes, and avoidance of things like database as a service, and embracing the use of standard virtual network appliances in a way that they can have repeatable architecture between all the CSPs, with a particular focus on resilient inter-CSP networking, with using fabrics like SD-WAN for that interconnectivity through resilient networking.
So I guess traditionally like within the last 15 years, right, there was this conversation about, do I deploy to a single CSP? Do I just make a choice and use all of the higher level services that they provide, or do I do the work and try to make my workload transferable across CSPs? And I might choose to do that for price or for availability or what have you. Is that now a decision that's been made for me?
I think the portability is not only from the perspective of DORA compliance, but from a resiliency and a cost perspective, so that you're not locked into a single vendor. So far too often we see people locked in. They've made technology choices which unfortunately have led them down a kind of technology cul-de-sac. They're locked into that vendor, and to move away from that, it makes it incredibly expensive to refactor and re-architect their way out of the solution, out of their existing solution.
So is this advice that a good consultant would have given anyway to make your workload transferable across CSPs? Is that just what we're moving towards? It's now kind of been legislated against?
Well, I think a lot of the major consultancies align themselves with a particular cloud. So with Accenture, you've got a very heavy alignment with Microsoft. They would recommend adopting Azure Functions as the easiest way to get your applications written in Azure. Unfortunately, that's a technology choice that's now very much locked you into the Azure ecosystem, making it very difficult to move away. I think the independent consultants would have always pushed the Kubernetes containerized workloads, but unfortunately, Fashion has said, well, that's a very difficult route. You know, Kubernetes only for web scale, but actually they're missing the point that it's true portability if you go down that route.
And just one last question, and this is for Sarah, who mentioned incident response, and I guess again that might have been tied to a particular CSP's offering. Has DORA changed how we do incident response now? Is there an architecturally better solution?
Is that still to me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I think there's a conversation about observability, which is
the one I was going to come on
anyway.
to. Yeah, so but basically, if you're embracing technologies like OpenTelemetry and you use things like OpenTelemetry Collector, whereas in the past you would be writing your application and it would be relatively tightly coupled to an observability stack. If you're an ISV and you're trying to target portability, or you're looking at DORA compliance and you want portability, if you embrace OpenTelemetry Collector, you can configure the observability stack you want on the back end for your log aggregation, your event metrics, and your distributed tracing, which makes it incredibly flexible and portable at the same time with minimum rework. So that's the route that we're following, and I think it's a trend that seems to be gathering momentum to move towards that as an option.
Right. And then Tim, any thoughts from you in the client work that you're doing, like in terms of re-architecting their existing platform?
I think we work. I think there's two sort of case studies here. We work with one organization which is viciously cloud agnostic and has developed all of their systems using Kubernetes and every technology they can in order not to lock themselves into any cloud vendor. When they deploy onto both cloud platforms. That's cost them an awful lot of money to do that. So they've paid their money up front to have this flexibility. We work with another firm who've taken a much more conscious, or I suppose a more pragmatic choice, which is that they will use cloud agnostic technology for the core scaffolding of their system, but they will use specialist services from AWS or Google, wherever appropriate, which they can bolt on. But what they've had to do is go through those services and work out a exit strategy for those platforms to work out, well, if we want to withdraw the use of lambdas in AWS they were using, so if we want to go away from lambdas and go to another route, how would we do that, and come up with a technical architecture? And that's where we've helped them to say, well, actually, how do we build a cloud agnostic escape route, an off ramp for you from the AWS structure, which is where they're predominantly on, so that they can move to Azure at some point in the future, should they need to.
Right. And that sounds like more than just re-architecting, that's making changes at the code level, right? To move away from a lambda system.
In this case, it is. So they're not necessarily making the code changes, but they've got a project plan, a design in place to know what they would need to do in order to move lambdas across to an alternative architecture to deploy it. And the architecture they've chosen is quite a heavy one, but it would still work. It just wouldn't be as cost effective to run it that way with the way currently lambdas are priced.
It sounds like there's maybe a bit of regret in the space there. I guess one I think we've got a question, right? Yeah, the question I was going to ask has just come. Is there a timeline for those folks to move towards that architecture? I mean, are they now out of like are they in trouble, right?
Well, DORA is in effect now. It came into effect at the beginning of the year. So I think the fundamental reason why this cloud agnostic architecture exists is the desire by EU regulators not to be held ransom by one cloud provider, and to get into the position which I think many governments have found themselves in the last 20 years with big technology vendors, where you just can't exit them. And the fear was that the banking system is so reliant on certain cloud providers that they could effectively hold the EU to ransom to by, for example, increasing the cost of services, or if those services were no longer deemed safe. For example, if there was a security vulnerability discovered in one of them, and the EU wanted to put an advisory out to move people away from that vendor, would people be able to do that in a sensible amount of time? So the answer to the question is people are not compliant if they can't move, but I don't think there's an obligation on a particular time frame that they have to be able to move to move their services
Okay.
across.
I can
Richard.
I can touch on that a little as well. If you look at the trade war, so no one's architected for what's happened recently since the start of the year. So things have changed very rapidly due to the trade war, but that's affecting the cloud providers significantly, and the costs will go up because you've only got to look around the internet and search for that type of news item, and you'll see that there's definitely a lot of discussion going on about cloud providers being affected by these tariffs. So you can see that's going to filter down to costs. If they're significant, where the trade war is a significant cost, then it's definitely coming. And that's a scenario that probably wasn't there before, but it's certainly a scenario that people should be talking about right now.
Right. And I guess that speaks to the international nature of financial services and how legislation that exists in the EU is kind of truly global, right?
Yeah.
I think before we get into the scope and the uptake of making architectural changes, I'm keen to just stay at the technical level and ask about scenario testing. I think one of the big changes that's come in. Richard, is that something that you can talk to us about?
Could I chime in with a quick question before you move on?
That's a question from Stuart. Yeah, sure.
Hi, just on the subject of cloud portability, I'm curious to understand sort of where in the regulation this presents itself, because Article 30 is for critical providers. Point number 3 talks about developing exit strategies, and so my experience so far with our clients in the EU, for those both classing as critical and non-critical, all we've ever had to do is provide a clear exit strategy for some of our ICT supply chain on our side, and that includes cloud providers. But we've never had much pressure at all from financial entities in the EU to prove portability on cloud providers. So I'm curious to understand where this is sort of coming from. Under ISO 27001, for example, exit strategies are mandatory anyway for all of these suppliers. So it's no different to what it was before under some of these standards. Can you provide any sort of reference to where in the regulation this is stipulated?
There's no regulations that I'm aware of as yet. I'm talking more towards I'm basically forecasting what I'm seeing happening in, just from reading the news and understanding how these companies operate. If they're going to be subject to significant price increases due to this trade war, those prices are going to filter down to businesses in the EU. If you can't exit one of these large businesses, now I've worked for a company that does have, these approaches to pricing to maximize their profits. If you're completely embedded in one provider, and you're now subjecting that provider to requests for DORA legislation to be compliant, obviously they're gonna bring that cost back to you. If they get lots of companies are exposed to DORA and it's a significant part of their market, then potentially the costs won't be so significant. But if it's not that large, then those companies that are subject to DORA are going to be hit quite hard with prices. So unless you can move, you're going to be stung.
This is more of a risk, as you say, to us. So, for example, my company being an ICT provider to financial entities in the EU, it's more of a risk to us in terms of cost pressure or whatever other pressures there are, but it's not so much a regulation requirement, because I'm not seeing that in the regulation at the moment. Portability is just a concern; it's not a regulatory requirement.
I think, Stuart, as a software vendor, you need to have the company engaging you if you're providing a critical financial service to that firm, they need to have an off-ramp for you and your firm, should your firm no longer become persona non grata, for example. But the cloud regulations, as you say, 27001 covered the need to be able to offboard technology and be agnostic. It's just not everybody complied with that, whereas DORA now captures everybody. So most of the firms that we deal with have been ISO 27001 compliant for many years, and therefore most of the DORA obligations are quite easy to hit. But it's effectively now mandatory under DORA that some firms which previously weren't caught. And in this, I'm thinking of financial fintechs, payment provider startups, which have sort of sailed fairly under the radar for quite a while, are now actually being caught not caught, but they're now subject to these regulations and now need to take a step back in their acquisition strategy to make sure that they are compliant. But I think one of the best ways to become compliant is to become ISO 27001 compliant, because actually that covers a lot of what would be required for you to tick the boxes for DORA.
Agreed, although I think DORA under the exit or transition plan, as they call it, goes a bit further. So you need to have off-ramps and exit strategies for your supply chain. But what the entity is looking for is a transition plan for itself to move away from your services. So you come under any sort of risk or threat of not being able to provide that service. So it goes a little bit further than ISO, but I agree with you that ISO sets you up quite nicely.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Thanks for the question there, Stuart. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. One is a timeline in that plan to move away from the CSP. I think, Tim, we've spoken about that. Another one from Ketan. Do you see any action amongst insurance clients adopting DORA? So alongside financial services, but in the same kind of regulatory space, any action there?
We have one insurance client who doesn't really know what DORA is and wasn't particularly interested in talking about it when we were discussing their sort of IT strategy. So I think based on a sample size of one, there's not a huge amount of appetite in insurance for making massive transitions and massive changes to their technology. To be fair to them, there's an awful lot else going on in the insurance markets just now around digitization and technology. So I think it's one of many things which they're dealing with at the moment. So I think it's not because of DORA specifically. I just think it's wrapped up in a lot of other initiatives which are going on in the insurance markets as that becomes more digitized.
A similarly regulated space, but I think the smart money would be on looking at legislation to the left and to the right of you so that you can avoid some of the pitfalls that we've seen in financial services who haven't architected their systems to be multi-cloud. Rich, I saw you came off mute. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
No, I'm good. I didn't touch anything, so I don't.
This is by default. So let's start to talk about how the cloud service providers are responding, right? Because it sounds like we're starting to touch in that space. I guess, Richard, Tim, what are you seeing? Matt, we had a question from Nick about DORA in action, and I guess this is where we can start to talk about that. How are the CSPs responding to DORA? Matt, let's hear from you.
Yeah, so what we're seeing from the major cloud providers, so AWS have introduced a fault injection service, and they're targeting it specifically for scenario testing for AWS cloud in isolation. What you've seen is follow-on activities from Azure. So Azure have got Chaos Studio and GCP have got Chaos Mesh. They're all loosely based around the concept of Chaos Monkey, which is an open source framework that came out of Netflix. They all, to some degree, enable you to test to a degree your services and prove that you're taking adequate testing as part of the audit requirement for DORA, that you're adequately testing your system. But this needs to be coupled with an automated test strategy using tools like Playwright and Grafana K6, and demonstrating that not only are you simulating faults on the CSP, you're also injecting those tests in an automated fashion at significant volume, that's substantial enough to prove that your architecture can survive outages. Some of this, if you're comparing to the Googles of the world or the other large startups, that this is the kind of thing, the bread and butter thing that they've always done in terms of testing at web scale. It's something that perhaps smaller customers are definitely not familiar with. So it's a real culture shift to get them to look at and consider these. So there's also probably a paper-based review that you'd need to conduct before you started looking at these tests to identify the potential single points of failure where you need to beef up your architecture, particularly around the network vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities around protocols such as DNS and BGP, I don't think people enough people understand the vulnerabilities introduced by those and how to mitigate or work around those. So it opens a whole smorgasbord of possibilities, but I don't think people are truly ready for this. It's a real culture shift.
And the folks at the CSPs, have they stepped back a little from their kind of their offering specific technologies at the platform level? And I mean, it sounds like the Chaos Monkey tooling again is introducing more platform specific work.
Yeah, so if I was being cynical, so they're all focused on their own clouds. When you start introducing a concept of multi-cloud environments where customers want to test involving multiple clouds, the CSPs are obviously less interested because they only care about their own cloud environment, and they're not interested in helping people off-ramp onto someone else or support a multi-cloud environment. So they're very much focused on their own environments, their own turf. And they're also interested in making sure, making it more difficult for people to come off. So it's almost like ring fencing and trying to prevent people from coming off, making it actually harder for them to come off. I think the only people I'm seeing who have seen the opportunity here is people like Oracle, and because their market share is so low, they're basically pitching themselves as, hey, come to us, use us as a multi-cloud environment. We've got the capacity, guys. If you want to come to us, we've got the capacity. They're the only guys that seem to be embracing this because they see the opportunity. Right.
Richard, any thoughts from you with the folks that you're speaking to?
Well, it's just from personal experience, it's just the support that they provide. DORA's got much stricter reporting timeframes. I think it's like, within 24 hours for any incident, you need to report it, within 4 hours of classification. So they're really tight. And if you look at the cloud providers, the support that they provide, if you're trying to do some sort of root cause, trying to classify an issue that's sort of intermittent, you can be on the wrong support plan, or the support plan can just be too expensive. So there's definitely some conflict there. And I can't see, if you go to the cloud providers, a lot of their policies for DORA are hidden. You have to apply to get those policies sort of shared with your organization. So yeah, I don't know how that's going to work. I guess it's only since January. So
presumably you have to pay for that support plan across all the cloud service providers that you use or might use, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, 4 hours. Once you've classified it, you've got to raise it within 4 hours, but do the whole lot within 24. If you're on a cloud provider's standard support plan, it doesn't meet those requirements at all. So that some of these support plans can be quite expensive for short reporting timeframes.
Yeah. So Matt, again, you came off mute. I'm spying on the mute icons. What are your thoughts there?
So I think people also need to remember the shared responsibility model with these CSPs. So they may not actually have access to critical elements of their infrastructure. So for example, on Kubernetes, if you use AKS or EKS, those master nodes are being managed by the CSP. And you may require access to elements of those to diagnose and perform root cause analysis, as we just talked about. And if you're on the wrong support plan, it's game over. You're not going to be able to meet those requirements.
And you won't find out until you're in a sticky situation, as is usually the way of these things, right?
Correct.
Right. All right. Okay. So let's just step back a little bit and hear from Tim again about what's in scope. Like, what does the regulation actually look like, and particularly enforcement? And again, like just going back to that conversation about organizations of different sizes, it sounds like there's a cost element to being compliant with DORA that, whilst not entirely hidden, might not hit you until you have a data breach or something falls over. What are some of the elements? Let's talk about that, Tim.
I think on the enforcement side, that's probably more a Matt question than myself. I'm more on the getting ready to make sure nothing nasty comes to hit you. In terms of getting ready, I would say probably most of the work we did on DORA was in the second half of last year to get companies compliant around the edges of the areas where they were not comfortable. And this was around policies and procedures and the way they procured services to make sure that they were including the DORA checklist within those onboarding mechanisms. So that's kind of as much sort of prep as we did. And then we've obviously touched quite a lot of length about cloud providers, CSPs, but any sort of technology providers, and the ability for you not to get yourself locked in with any of those firms. That was another important element at the tail end of last year. It has gone pretty quiet since then, with new participants coming into market, really us steering them towards all the hygiene factors, ISO 27001 and the other regulations, ISA 3402. If you're an asset manager trading in the US, so there's lots of other regulations which you need to also be mindful of. So I think it's kind of become part of the soup now of regulations, rather than something which people are specifically worrying about on its own now.
And it sounds like for larger organizations that are fairly kind of au fait with regulatory compliance, they've had a bit of an easier ride because A, they're already compliant with much of the legislation in the space, and B, they've got the money to spend on good support contracts and not to be surprised by that kind of thing. But for smaller organizations, there's a number of factors, right? So A, they might move into a regulatory space that they weren't previously in. And there I'm thinking of like small payment providers and small credit providers. And B, there might be startups that find themselves in the payment space or in the financial services space, and aren't used to being regulatory compliant, and now find themselves with architectural concerns and also large expensive support contracts. What are some of the thoughts there about smaller organizations moving into this space?
If you're coming back to me, your quick thoughts on that. I view this as an opportunity, actually. We work with one company who were very much tied into AWS, and we're building a fintech product. Can't say much more on that, but it's a fintech product which was they weren't regulated, but the companies that they were dealing with were all regulated. And they had procured a lot of credits inside AWS to actually develop their product. But when we did the review for them, and this was going back a few years when DORA was first announced, when we reviewed their technology stack, we said, well, you are being far too cloud specific and requiring your customers to focus on a particular technology. So actually, it's actually good hygiene for you to build your system in a way that can be deployed on any cloud provider and is as flexible as possible. They followed that advice. This would have been just prior to COVID, actually. We first started working with them, and then over the next 2 years, we worked with them on building a cloud agnostic strategy. They've won a lot of clients using Azure, because Azure really has taken off in financial services, particularly in the Middle East, where they really found their stride. And this cloud agnostic strategy has served them very well as a business, because they're now able to deploy onto any tech stack dictated by their clients. So I would not view it necessarily as a negative and as something which is going to cost us money. I view it as an opportunity for you to open up and make yourself available to the widest possible community of customers.
Fantastic, thanks, Tim. So let's go to Matt on that point then and talk a little bit about regulation and enforcement and what that looks like, and then we'll scoot back to Richard and talk about opportunities again.
Yeah, I just want to touch on the comment from that Tim said. So it's basically maximizing your addressable market by having the portability and the breadth of offering. You can offer to anyone using any CSP. There's a small amount of rework per cloud around identity and object storage, but other than that, you've maximized your addressable market. Just going back to the size of entities and whether or not they're covered by DORA. So a lot of people have crept into this embedded finance space and don't realize that they're actually, if they're offering services in Europe, they are going to be considered under DORA. So I'm thinking of a UK retailer group that's got a recent problem. So I think in their recent problem, they've had a problem with resiliency. They've got a problem with card data and also personal identifiable information. So the financial repercussions of that, it's a triple whammy, and it's going to be painful. You're talking about smaller merchants or financial entities just being wiped out by this potentially if they get it wrong. So
yeah, that sounds pretty painful. I guess in terms of the opportunity that you talked about, there's this old trope about regulation, which is that it's better in any space that you're in to comply with the most conservative legislation in that space, because that helps you cover all bases.
Yeah, so I mean, we've taken the view that obviously from the offset, we need to be compliant with GDPR, PII, we need to be compliant with PCI DSS, obviously, and we need to be compliant with DORA. We need the portability to be able to offer our products to those that are operating within the EU. And we believe that that is also going to go global. So we know the United States are looking at a similar legislation to DORA. Going back to the point about the trade war, I actually think it could move more people to what's being called a European sovereign cloud around data sovereignty. So under current US law, under the Patriot Act, basically US companies can be forced to hand over data. That's got massive implications for the CSPs, who could be ordered by the US authorities to share data. So if you're not encrypting your data correctly, leaves your business very vulnerable. So I think there will be a push to a European sovereign cloud purely to comply with data sovereignty requirements. So countries like Poland already have strict rules like this, and I think it will become more common in Europe that they will require data sovereignty.
Right, we look forward to that. Thanks very much, Matt. And Richard, just to tie off the conversation about opportunities or compliance, your thoughts there?
Yeah, so there's two. I guess there's two people I'd like to address. One, if you're a small provider, then this, you could just head down and try and adapt your ISO 27001 controls to meet DORA and sort of tick a box. But I think you're missing a trick. I think really, if you've got the ability to implement DORA, you can expand your market and you can beat some of your competitors. You potentially can go like what we said previously. You can address multiple, being available on multiple clouds and expand your market. So don't see it as a lost investment. You actually potentially can grow your revenue with it. But if you're a larger organization, I think, you're architecting for this. You're expected to deliver an architecture that works within all of these regulations. And I think you really have to push to highlight that, these changes, impact your architecture, and you've got that opportunity to win budget for to address some technical debt, and that's having a European sovereign cloud provider, that should be discussed as one of the scenarios. If we need to move to one of those, it's going to take us 18 months to do the work. Should we at least get rid of some of that technical debt right now and start pushing the agenda for some of that work? It pushes the agenda you probably want to push as an architect anyway. So I just think that there's a lot of opportunity to get your technical debt off of your backlog. No one wants to talk about it, right? So DORA is a really good excuse.
It's really nice to have a vast European regulator looking over your shoulder and helping you push your technical debt work. Yeah,
exactly.
Amazing. Folks, thanks very much. We've heard today from Matt Scott from NimbusPay, Tim Palmer from Blue Hat, and Richard Halldearn from Codecutter.io. And we'd love now to take questions from the audience. If you want to come off mute and just yell, or if you want to drop something in the chat, or if you want to be polite and put your hand up, we're open to all comers. It sounds like we've answered everyone's questions, folks.
That's good.
100% coverage of the conversation. Thank you so much. There's one new message in the chat. Does DORA include FMECA type analysis? Frantically Googling FMECA.
So it's basically a classic failure mode analysis. Yeah. So I think there's a requirement under your resiliency. So when you're auditing the resiliency of your design, you will need to do failure mode analysis, and you will need to demonstrate that in your testing. So if you're using AWS, for example, AWS fault injection, that you've taken appropriate steps to make your architecture as resilient as possible. This does go back and say, well, have you deployed in the cheapest way possible? So you're only using servers in a placement group in 1AZ. You probably won't get through that resiliency testing. So the implications are your costs may increase to get a more resilient solution. So there's also that needs to be considered. But you're right, yes, failure mode analysis or failure mode effect critical analysis is a requirement.
Thanks for jumping in and saving the date there, Matt. Peter, I see you've come off mute. is there something you'd like to add or a question you've got?
Yeah, quick question. You mentioned the US is looking at potential DORA-like legislation. Would that be federal level or state levels? Like the California Consumer Protection Act is only state level. And also for those dealing with entities in Asia, what about Singapore or Hong Kong or Tokyo? Do you see any legislation coming there?
So I think it would be federal level, not state level. And there are murmurings around Singapore following a similar route. I think there's also something in Australia that's going to come as well at a later date. So they're very much, I think the world is kind of watching and seeing how well the European legislation works, whether they need to tweak the approach. But I think there's a lot of very nervous people out there. It's, well, from a technology perspective, it stimulates a lot of demand, but from a business perspective, it's very concerning. It obviously increases your costs at a time where we've already got significant cost inflation and potential trade war scenarios. So it's not what anyone wants at this point in time.
Thanks again, Matt, and thanks, Peter, for the question. A couple more in the chat. One from Maxim. Any figures to share around flexible multi-cloud architecture versus single cloud? I think the greater than sign is applicable there, but it looks like Richard and Tim, maybe you can talk about numbers or at least directionality.
Yeah, so I think that if you're going multi-cloud, then you're going to be using services that are not, that they're not shared infrastructure as much as you get with platform as a service. You share a lot of infrastructure with that, and it's much cheaper. So, for example, a good one is if you've got a big data platform, that you're doing a lot of data analysis on, like BigQuery, which is a bespoke system that's built on Google Cloud. You're not going to be able to achieve the same costs for that. If you're implementing it to move easily, and then it's going to cost you a lot to implement it on BigQuery and then pick AWS's equivalent. So there'll either be a cost of implementation or a cost to run it, but they're all going to be higher than what you have with a single cloud solution.
Could I jump in there with a question as well, just related to this multi-cloud and somewhat cost as well? Still not entirely understanding this. So we spoke about having portability across clouds. A lot of talk around AWS, Azure, and so on that support things like fault injection, et cetera. But if we're really trying to hedge against the issues of trade wars or sovereignty of data, we're talking about European clouds, so which don't support these kind of services at the moment. And if you did, you're going to be running all of this yourself at a considerable cost, at considerable risk. And so what we're really talking about is multi-cloud, possibly with using European cloud providers. It's a whole different ballgame. I don't think I'd be happy to do that right now. I think the cost for small to medium-sized businesses to run all of their infrastructure themselves without any managed services is considerable. And I think to be able to support things like your own fault injection strategy, your own observability framework is a tall ask for small to medium-sized businesses. So I'm not entirely sure how multi-cloud, especially across the big providers, works to that objective. And I'm not sure that any European providers are fit for that just yet either. Any thoughts on how you would go about solving some of those risks in multi-cloud?
I guess it depends.
Do you want to jump in on that? Maybe then, Richard?
Yeah, I can do. I guess it depends on the complexity of your solution. So if your WordPress, runs most of the internet, you'll be able to go onto every cloud provider's site, and they'll have, a deployment pattern that you can deploy WordPress to any of those cloud providers. But it's really simple. It's a web server and a database at its simplest deployment, but you can go all the way up to deploying it on Kubernetes. It's a lot more complicated to run it that way, but you can do that. I guess from your perspective, if you've got a complex architecture, it is going to be a lot harder. But I think this on a case-by-case basis. And if you're not a Goldman Sachs or a Morgan Stanley, maybe you're a supplier that needs to be that those larger companies you sell to needs to have a alternative solution for, but it's not up to you to have multiple multi-cloud. They probably don't want the cost. So
agreed. But if we follow sort of Matt's guidance in terms of having some sort of automated testing, fault injection testing, and going the whole hog on that route, If you had to do this all yourself, that's a lot of work. And that's just one example of where you would have to do all of this yourself. So I think there's still there's definitely a trade-off here, but I still think there's a really big advantage for smaller to medium-sized companies to leverage the support of a cloud service provider that provides a lot of this as managed services. It also, in my view, seems less risky to try and do all of this yourself, especially if you don't have the skills or the resources to do that. You're almost certainly going to be taking on too much complexity, and therefore introducing a risk in of itself.
Yeah, definitely. So if you pick certain open source solutions that these cloud providers support, like Postgres, every cloud provider provides a package for Postgres. They have different tiers. It can be made high availability. You just check the box. You use the cloud provider, but they're supporting an open source solution. If you can lean mostly on those open source solutions, your plan is, well, we'll just move our Postgres instance over to a different provider, and that's your plan. Done. So,
Tim, we've got some thoughts there.
Yeah, I think it's very much horses for courses. We're working with a hedge fund who do want to be cloud agnostic because they don't want anyone holding them to ransom. Your point on there isn't a European offer, that's correct, but their view would be if Europe went its own way and said we need to do our own cloud, they would strike a deal with, for example, AWS and say, well, we want an AWS ring-fenced Amazon service in Europe, completely governed by Europeans. So it would probably be a way of doing that. So and you can't really build against something that's mythical, doesn't really exist yet. So they're sort of following just good practice of saying, well, we'll build things which are wherever possible, we do not lock ourselves into one particular vendor or use deep parts of their service. The exception to all of this is AI, because when you look at the AI libraries and the clever modules coming out of Google, particularly for this firm, they're using a lot of the Google proprietary technology, and switching away from that will be very hard for them to move to another service, not because the other services don't exist, but just that they're different and they're not. You can't compare a Google AI model to a Microsoft AI model. They will produce different results and different levels of quality. So in that case, they're viewing everything in a modular way and saying, well, some things are proprietary and are locked into particular cloud vendors. And if we had to go down that route, we would have to suffer that pain. But I think it's very much, it's part of your enterprise and solution architecture discussions as to where exactly you sit with all of these things. I don't think you can be too prescriptive and say we have to be completely cloud agnostic, because that's just not realistic in this current world, particularly the speed of AI at the moment.
Thanks, Tim. And again, thanks, Stuart, for the discussion there. We've got one last question in the chat from Assad again. So how much of DORA is security related and how much is around performance and availability? That's a fairly specific question.
Yeah, so I mean, my response was it's security related only where it might compromise service availability. So thinking about distributed denial of service attacks or DDoS protection. It's not specifically around security, it's around the resiliency of your service. So indirectly, security problems may compromise your service availability, so you should design around it to avoid those things. But DDoS protection only gets you so far. So so you need compensating controls and compensating strategies on how you may survive a DDoS attack or how you may distribute your service over multiple regions.
Matt,
All right.
if I could ask a question related to that as well. So what we've seen in contracts from our customers is that they typically include a full coverage of minimum security measures across both confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So although I understand the regulation is mainly around availability, in reality, the contracts we've seen under Article 30 tend to include security measures across the board.
Yeah, and they normally are related to other operating requirements, not just the DORA itself. So it's DORA plus other regulatory requirements. But yeah, you're right there. There are more modern ways to approach things like trusted execution environments, trusted platform modules, trusted boots, all those kind of things, again, they only get you so far. So, you know, if I think a lot of CSPs do kind of have wishy-washy statements around DDoS protection. So, yeah, it's something that I've seen in the past as being problematic regards to SLAs from the CSPs. So it's something to be careful of and wary of.
And to kind of paraphrase, you know, Stuart's point, difficult to have a conversation about operational resilience without talking about security. Fantastic. Folks, thanks very much for joining us today. We've had Matt Scott from NimbusPay, Tim Palmer from Blue Hat, and Richard Halldearn from Codecutter.io. I've been Sam Moorhouse from Turntable, and I've just finished my coffee, but it was hot until the end. So thanks for joining us for this hour, and we'll hand back to Barry Cranford from RecWorks.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Tim. And thanks for everyone that got involved. We'll be following up shortly to try and get some feedback. And we're very interested in what we should do next and the time after that. So if you'd like to have a place on the panel, if you've got a particular subject that you'd be keen to hear spoken about, then please do let us know. So yeah, we'll be in touch. Thanks again, everyone. And we'll see you next time. Cheers
Thanks
all.
very much, everyone.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.